If you ever take a stroll through your local grocery store and you compare your shopping cart prices today to like 1 or 2 years ago, then you already know that inflation is a very real thing, and for most people, it's a very real problem. In this video, I'm going to explain why inflation, unfortunately, cannot be zero. But I'm also going to do one more thing. I'm going to explain how this little economic cycle thing that we have, the one that makes a little bit of inflation acceptable, might just change very soon. And I'm going to explain how that change will probably affect our lives much more than the actual inflation itself. So without further ado, as always, my name is Derek and I got my degree in finance, so you don't have to. Let's answer the question, why can't inflation just be zero? First and foremost, we need to understand the two different types of inflation. They tend to be used interchangeably, but they are different. There is monetary inflation, which is an increase in the money supply or currency, which usually leads to price inflation, which is exactly what it sounds like. Increase in prices due to the devaluation of that currency by increasing its supply. But that doesn't always happen. If a central bank increases the money supply due to an increase in demand or population so that there is just enough extra money to go around to produce the increased supply required due to the higher demand, then that monetary inflation should not, in that scenario, cause price inflation. Now, price inflation is exactly what it sounds like, an increase in prices. Price inflation can happen because of monetary inflation, because more money circulating means each unit of that money is worth less, but price inflation can also happen for many other reasons, like supply chain issues or anything that might cause supply chain issues like war, natural disasters, tariffs, etc. Or simply just companies raising prices because they can. Now, here's the thing. The government and the central banks do have some control over both monetary and price inflation. And as we've seen recently, an ability to bring down that inflation. And most recently, it peaked in 2022 at close to 10%, which is extremely high, at least for the United States and European standards. But inflation now in the United States is much closer to 3%. So how was this accomplished? Well, through monetary policy, primarily raising the federal funds rate, as well as removing money from the market by selling treasury bonds. The first makes it more expensive to buy things on credit and more expensive for businesses to borrow money to grow, which, if everything is more expensive, slows spending. The second removes money by people giving the Fed money in return for treasury bonds, thus removing currency out of circulation. Here's the problem though. Higher interest rates also makes it harder for those already stretched thin by higher prices. Now the average citizen has to deal with higher prices and higher costs to borrow money to deal with those higher prices. But in the long run, this has brought down inflation, which means central banks, in the case of the United States, the Federal Reserve, do have methods at bringing down inflation. And on top of that, so far with everything that we've discussed, seems like inflation is bad for everyone. And that begs the question, why doesn't the government and the Federal Reserve continue this monetary policy until inflation reaches zero? Well, to answer the question before answering the question, because the Fed doesn't want 0% inflation. The Fed does not want prices to remain the same. In fact, they want the opposite. They want a small amount of inflation every single year. Why though? Why make their own citizens basically poorer every single year? Now we need to talk about the economic cycle to understand it all. And that starts with me and you, The consumer. Consumers spend money. That money is spent on products. These products are made by companies, and those companies pay their employees, who are in turn consumers. And here is the main reason governments, central banks, and economic leaders want a little bit of inflation: to motivate spending. Essentially, if consumers know that this year, everything they buy, from big things like cars and appliances to little things like shoes and groceries, will be more expensive next year than they are today, then they're more likely to buy now, as opposed to waiting when it's more expensive. Now, this sounds simple, but this little piece to the puzzle, inflation, to encourage spending, is vital for the economic cycle that we rely on to work. And that's because this keeps companies in business, and it allows these companies to make more money every single year, which in theory allows companies to raise wages, which again, in theory, as long as wages grow faster than the rate of inflation, means inflation isn't actually causing any harm at all, because price increases are balanced out by wage increases. And in that scenario, where wages increase faster than the increase in prices, then real inflation is actually zero, even though monetary and price inflation is greater than zero. But that doesn't really answer the question. Why not just aim for 0% inflation so we don't even have to worry about any of this stuff, like salaries keeping up with price inflation in the first place? Well, because the opposite of inflation is deflation. And not only is deflation bad for the economy, but unlike inflation, which can be fixed by raising interest rates, nobody really knows how to fix deflation. Now, what is deflation? Simply put, it's a reduction in prices. And the reason deflation is so dangerous is because it has the exact opposite effect on that economic cycle that is so vital that we talked about earlier. Deflation makes people save money, and it makes people put off purchases for as long as possible, because people know that things will be cheaper in the future. That car, for example, that they kind of sort of need to buy today, will be cheaper next year when they really need to buy it. So why not wait? And that same line of thinking goes for any purchase that can be put off into the future. Appliances, shoes, computers, fuel, home improvements, and basically anything else. And this, in turn, slows the economy, because each year, less and less stuff is being sold. This means each year, companies make less money, which means they have to start paying their employees less money. And it also means that their debts and their employees' debts, like business loans and home mortgages, which were created when prices were higher years ago, are now more expensive to pay back. And this is kind of like turning that economic cycle that we talked about in the opposite direction. Everything shrinks. People put off purchases, companies make less money, and employees get paid less. And this continues until everyone and every business goes bankrupt and the economy implodes. And the cherry on top of all of this, no one really knows how to fix deflation. We know how to fix inflation. You just keep raising rates until price increases slow down. But deflation? In theory, you do the opposite. You'd lower rates. But while you can raise rates theoretically to infinity, what if the Fed lowers rates all the way to 0% and prices keep falling? Then what? That is known as a deflationary spiral. And that is what's scary to central banks. And that's why they want to keep inflation around their target rate. For the US, that's around 2% per year. Enough to motivate spending, but not too much that wages can't keep up. But also high enough that if that inflation rate goes below that number, the Fed can quickly inject money into the economy or lower interest rates before a deflationary spiral begins. And now you know why inflation can't be zero. But I also said that there was a change on the horizon, which might just make this little economic cycle that we rely on so much obsolete. Artificial intelligence has arrived. But right now, besides for some very specific applications, it's mostly a gimmick for the average person. Can't draw accurately, can't really write a script with any sort of personality, and still forgets the questions that you just asked. So when you look up articles about AI, no one really seems too concerned about it taking people's jobs or affecting the economy negatively. But artificial intelligence, by its very nature, is exponential, and that means its growth is also exponential, which means, unlike humans, which seem to improve at things linearly, AI is going to increase the speed at which it gets better at everything. Now, our little economic cycle works for the most part because even with a little bit of inflation, if wages keep up or grow faster, then the real rate of inflation, the rate at which people lose purchasing power, is actually zero, even if price inflation is more than zero. But what happens when salaries stop growing or actually start decreasing? Precisely because companies start to rely more and more on artificial intelligence as it improves in its ability to do everything. What happens then when companies don't feel the need anymore to increase salaries to stay competitive at hiring top talent because AI starts doing those tasks just as good? Or what happens when AI gets even better than humans at most things, so companies start lowering salaries? You see, right now the opposite is true. Companies use AI right now because it's cheaper, not because it's better than humans. But if AI starts doing most tasks better than we do, then that balance flips. And then the only reason companies would want to hire a human is if that human is less expensive than AI. What happens in that scenario? Well, our awesome little economic cycle stops working because in that scenario, wages stop keeping up with inflation permanently. Now, currently, that might sound like crazy talk because AI is still drawing people with like 18 fingers and still makes all kinds of other errors that a human would easily catch. But take a deeper look. Look at how far artificial intelligence has come in just the last couple of years. Now, extrapolate that growth over the next 10 years. Not linearly though, but exponentially. Because that is how artificial intelligence grows, is exponentially. And that is kind of scary.